All right, again, I will like to thank you for all being here at our Natural Law Institute Spring Conference.
Summer.
It's not summer for a few days yet. Anyway, it's great to address such an esteemed audience of people as we attempt to work off our debts to our ancestors and our promises to our progeny, which is why I'm here, and I'm presuming that you are all here for the same purpose, and I appreciate that. I'm going to talk a little bit about our current situation and how that plays into the medical field. I would like to begin by reading from Professor Carroll Quigley's prescient 1961 book, The Evolution of Civilizations, which I highly recommend. Page 151 for you who are following. The age of conflict, stage 4, is a period of imperialist wars and irrationally supported for reasons that are different in the different social classes. The masses of the people who have no vested interest in the existing institutions of expansion engage in imperialist wars because it seems the only way to overcome the slowing down of expansion. Unable to get ahead by other means, such as economic means, they seek to get ahead by political action, above all, by taking wealth from their political neighbors. At the same time, they turn to irrationality to compensate for growing insecurity of life, for the chronic economic depression, for the growing bitterness and dangers of class struggles, for the growing social disruption and insecurity from imperialist wars. This is generally a period of gambling, use of narcotics or intoxicants, obsession with sex, frequently as perversion, increasing crime, growing numbers of neurotics and psychotics, growing obsession with death and the hereafter. Sound familiar to anyone? This was written in 1961. The vested interests encouraged the growth of imperialist wars because both serve to divert the discontent of the masses away from the elites' vested interests, the uninvested surplus of the civilization. Accordingly, some of the defenders of the vested interests divert a certain part of their surplus to create instruments of class oppression, instruments of imperialist wars, and instruments of irrationality. Once these instruments are created and begin to become institutions of class oppression, of imperialist wars, and of irrationality, the chances of the institution of expansion being reformed again into an instrument of expansion becomes almost nil. These three new vested interests, in combination with older vested interests of expansion, are in a position to prevent all reform. The last of these three, the old institution of expansion, now begins to lose its privileges and advantages to the three institutions it has financed. Of these three, the institution of class oppression controls much of the political power of society. The institution of imperialist wars controls much of the military power of the society. And the institution of irrationality controls much of the intellectual life of the society. These three, which may be combined into only one or two, become dominant, and the group that formerly controlled the institution of expansion falls into the secondary role. Its surplus is largely absorbed by its own creations. That's the end of the quote, which I find so good that I bookmark it and talk about it as much as I can possibly imagine. This reminds me of the Book of Changes, the Yi Jing, hexagram number 23, Splitting Apart. And I'm reading from a discourse on this subject. Things are not the way they seem. Reality appears to be a hall of mirrors. Intrigues are multiplying like summer flies, and there are rumors of discontent. It is the time of illusion, disintegration, distrust, and deception. When you find yourself trapped in a hall of mirrors, it becomes necessary to retrace your steps, return to the familiar, take solace in what is firm and secure. There is no blame in holding back. Indeed, it is your responsibility to keep your strength intact for the period of revival that follows the period of disintegration, as surely as dawn follows the night. Discretion is the better part of valor, and good timing is critical. Learn to choose the proper moments for action, thereby avoiding futile effort. Pay close attention to the changes that signal a time to retreat. In the realm of personal relations, discovering illusion can be painful and confusing. During a period such as this, it is wise to avoid undertaking bold new moves. It is especially important not to jump to conclusions when you sense that nothing is quite as it seems. When I was in college, I went to it was a liberal arts college in the Midwest, which fancies itself to be the Harvard of the Midwest, which I thought to be kind of a strange way to play. I learned of this Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." And I said, at the tender age of 20, I want to live in interesting times. I'm not 20 anymore, and times have got so much more spicy than I anticipated. This was in the early 1980s, and I made an agreement with that college, and the agreement was a contract in which I would pay my money, my time and attention, and perform with the expectation that they would provide me with the minimal education necessary to assume a position within civil society. In 2002, much later, I got out in '85, I learned what the dollar is and was, and I became enraged. Because at that moment, I learned that they committed a contractual fraud upon me, as I was never fit to enter into civil society because I don't understand what the terms of a contract are, which include the dollar, which I wanted to sue them, I still do, just for $1. Now, in the interim, since that time, about 20 years now, I've been following a gentleman named Martin Armstrong, he's a financier who did great work trading large amounts of money internationally. He invented the yen carry trade. He created an artificial intelligence system that he used to do that trade, and also a model which is based on public confidence in public and private waves. We are currently ending an era of public confidence in public institutions, which is due to end around 2032, according to this model. Now, this manifests as a waning popular confidence in public institutions due to ossification, or what we would call excessive rent seeking from the elites of those institutions, and public disillusionment with this process. Public appreciation for the institutions of cultural production moves from state of benignancy, which is we think they're good, to we think they're malignant. Interesting, this process occurs as a timed function, which fascinates me to no end, in which some event occurs in a precise moment in time, which causes the people's attitude to shift. And it's predictable. And then they later use what occurred at that time to justify their change in attitude. As the special interests, the rent seekers increasingly resort to coercion to influence via force, financial pressure, or other inducement the behavior of the public, as opposed to seeking to represent the concurrent commonality for common interests of those people who seek to restore social coherence via reform or circumvention of these institutions, as we described before, or acceptance of a new coherent communal political system that they seek us to fall into. This may be understood as increasing proportion of noise to signal in the public mind, causing them to shift their perception from these elites and institutions they work from being benign to being malignant. Consider what is to date not currently regarded in historical discourse, the 1917 point of entry of the United States into World War I, in which 95% of Americans did not want to enter World War I. And President Wilson promised not to enter into World War I. Confidence that the US government positively represents the interests of the people appears to have been quite misplaced for quite some time. Yeah. Now I will draw your attention to a gentleman that I would call the misshapen Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci. I'm trying to make that...
That's the nicest way I have heard him just spoken of.
I want to make it stick. He invented the concept of cultural hegemony when he was in Benito Mussolini's jail cell, which he was so kind as to put him in instead of otherwise dealing with him. Cultural hegemony is a construction where the cultural preferences of the elites are projected through the institutions of cultural production into the masses below. Mr. Gramsci also recommended in the 30s the following battle plan for domination, Marxist domination. He says there are 3 stages. In the first stage is the war of position within these institutions by which the Marxists would become those very elites. The second stage would create the cultural conditions necessary for the revolution, after which stage 3, the war of mobility occurs, in which the Marxists seek to destroy the forces of reaction against their revolution. This was called the Long March Through the Institutions by the German socialist Rudi Dutschke. For those interested in historical trivia, right? We appear to have lost the war of position, I'm afraid, and our institutions of cultural production are apparently entirely subverted, and we approach or are currently involved in the Cultural Revolution as so foretold. I'm sorry to say it. The question now goes to, what are the manifestations of this process in medicine? The manifestation of this perverse influence in a medical establishment is the focus of what I would like you to think about today. To understand this, it's necessary to understand that Big Pharma is a product of the institution of monopoly capitalism. It is an extension of the same function. Big Pharma spends immense sums for advertising paid to the media companies, as Big Pharma has the opportunity to withdraw its consent to continue to pay those big funds. This allows them to control the narrative of the media. I've been working with a gentleman for about 20 years now, and in our collective experience, and I've asked him this question, how many people have come to you saying they want a prescription because they saw some advertisement? We can count it on one hand. So that is not why they're doing it. So they have to be doing it for some other reason, and that's the only reason I could come up with is they attempt to control the narrative because you don't say bad things about the hand that feeds you. Big Pharma also spends immense sums to guide the medical colleges and the medical specialty colleges, strongly influencing the behavior of physicians and student physicians as they generate by education and the creation of professional practice guidelines and standards. Unfortunately, the production of research is also compromised in a similar fashion. The grant writing controls a large sum of this problem, as well as Big Pharma. Worse yet, there are cases of overtly fraudulent studies which have been published and retracted throughout the medical literature, which is utterly stunning and demoralizing, I think. We see manifestations of this in the regulatory agencies of the government as well. The regulatory agencies are suspect as being held captive by the special interests. There's a well-known pipeline for this regulatory agency to executive positions within their corporate entities they're regulating. Which, what do they call that?
Revolving door.
The revolving door. Thank you, Bryan. It's terrible. Presumably, such rewards are for good behavior towards the industry and not towards the public, I'm afraid. Now, in general, this has culminated in a number of projections within the public sphere all of which we are familiar with, which is the construction of social constructs such as chemtrails, climate change, multiculturalism, and COVID-19 comes to mind as well. All of this leads to the public having diminished confidence in the institutions of cultural production. But as I said earlier, we are most interested in the medical establishment. This is because the public's sense of loss of coherence of the signal coming out of these institutions, which represented the preferences of the elites, do not align with the truth, and certainly not with the interests of the public, at the expense of health and well-being of the public to boot. Now, in this context, I want to discuss the key victim of this process, which is the alteration of the doctor-patient relationship. All of this has resulted in the transformation of that relationship from a relational function in which the doctor relates to the patient to a transactional function in which the doctor deals with the patient for a fee. Physicians in this sense have become managers of disease as opposed to representing health and well-being of their patients, which is terrible and unfortunate. Patients have become demands upon the medical establishment which the doctor is to provide. Those patients lack responsibility for their health conditions and have an unlisting end of demands because they paid for treatment. Operationally, we recognize this in clinical encounters as patients are confused that what they think they're paying for medical treatments and they are not. Patients pay insurance companies to act as their financial representatives, and their financial representatives determines the limits of the treatment that the doctor is able to provide, which is removed and alienating to the relationship. The insurance company insure that which cannot be insured, which is an irresponsible patient, which is like, it's just a terribly degrading function for everybody involved. I tell the people this is that I sold my clinic to the hospital because you cannot make it in private practice where I was working. And when I did, what they did was they put a drain in the floor. And it drains the soul out of the room. And it's awful. It's like it drains the soul and the joy out of the room. And it's like, what a terrible place to be. And I try to make it work there. I tell a story like this is that the doctor comes to become aware of the nature of the medical establishment they're attempting to work in as being composed of giant bent wheels. And they're so big and so bent that no doctor can fix it. And so all that's left for the doctor to do is stack coins until he has enough to get clear while he keeps his hands out of the gears. That's the situation that doctors face. They call this in medical literature for many years now, they call it physician burnout. As if the physician has a problem because it's the resistance to getting your job done is so high that it's like it's going to burn you out. It's like, well, you just, terrible. So we come to a place of overburden to the providers and financial service providers to rise, all at the expense of the patient. I call it administrative overburden. In this light, we have to come to a new understanding for individual responsibility. For this reason, the importance of the individual responsibility comes to light with regards to one's health and well-being. We each have a duty to be responsible to ourselves and to seek responsible professionals who will guide us faithfully to our objective of optimum health. Medical providers have a duty to perform and to know the risks and benefits of each treatment that they are providing or encouraging the patient to take, and to continue to seek to learn more within that context. We must seek to build and maintain our health and strength for the great struggles that life must surely bring us in these uncertain times, which is no small thing because we have now, the authorities have demonstrated that they are not to be trusted entirely on face value, which is really challenging. I find it I apologize to patients with some frequency, which is to say, I send them to the specialist and the specialist says something to do which is against my advice. And I said, now you're in a pickle. This is not so good, because it's like you have two authorities that don't agree, and you have to figure out which one you prefer, which is a hell of a responsibility for a patient to take, because it's like they're not a medical professional, and it's like, maybe we get another opinion, because that might help. If it weren't too predictable. So we must organize our lives, our families, and our communities to serve our private interests, as well as those around us. In order to do this, we must expand our efforts to do what we do here at the Natural Law Institute, which is we serialize and disambiguate through recursive disambiguation to falsify claims made by competing interests for our attention, so that we may avoid becoming engaged in what might otherwise be later be revealed as mere hysteria. And that's all I have for you, kids. Oh, wait. I wanted to recommend a book. Are we still going, Francis?
Yep.
I wanted to recommend actually, I brought two books. This is the book that I wanted everybody to read, and I have copies in the back, anybody who wishes to pick it up, which is about the use of corporations or contracts in the context of trusts to organize ourselves outside of the entanglements of the legal community.
Can you say the name of the book?
Oh, the book is called The Unincorporation by James Billings. Unleashing the Power of Business Trust for Your Protection and Privacy.
It's a legal form of private aristocracy.
Yes. Thank you, Curt.
I can get behind anything like that.
There you go. I read this book on the way here, which is this book I bought it when I saw the title of it, and I learned that the author suffered an untimely death soon after he published the book and was talking about it, which I highly recommend because it describes the organization of monopoly capitalism and how they gain control of governments and world events for a long time. And this one I highly recommend, A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. And I'll show that to the audience. A short book. I read it on the airplane on the way here, and it has lots of pictures. And it's not very long, and it's so exciting to read it. Anyway, I thank you for your attention.